You're thinking about it all wrong. Dane Kestrel leaned back in his seat, arms crossed, watching the alien across from him with a smirk that barely concealed his irritation. The Xenotheory War Academy lecture hall pulsed with ambient energy, its laser plasma displays flickering with the shifting data streams of planetary predator classifications. The chamber itself was massive, designed to accommodate species from across the galaxy. Retractable seating for those with extra appendages, gravity modulation for low-mass beings, even filtration zones for gas-based life forms. Yet, for all the sophistication, the students still thought like children. Across the room, Varesh, a crystalline-bodied Altari, stood with arms folded, if they could be called arms. His fractal exoskeleton refracted light in shifting patterns, a species-specific display of condescension. If humans are so adaptive, Varesh's voice rang like metal striking glass, sharp and grating, then why do your species lack any biological advantage? No claws, no venom, no natural armor. By every evolutionary metric, you shouldn't exist. Murmurs rippled through the assembled students, gravelly clicks from the insectoid Varek, subharmonic oscillations from the towering Gurzakul, the deep trill of the amphibious Zifferans. Their collective eyes, sensors, and thermal receptors locked onto Dane. He rolled his shoulders, ignoring the way his academy uniform tugged against his collar. They always came back to this question. Always assumed humans were soft, vulnerable, a cosmic mistake that somehow fumbled its way into space. Dane pushed forward, planting his elbows on the desk. He let the silence stretch, let their curiosity fester like an open wound before he spoke. You ever hear of a shark? The laser plasma display shifted, rippling across the curved wall like a living thing. A rendering of Carcharodon carcharius materialized, a great white shark, its obsidian eyes void of hesitation, its body built for nothing but the kill. Rows of serrated teeth gleamed under simulated light, each one designed to tear, not chew. A flick of his fingers and the image changed. Slow-motion footage of a breach. A 2,000-kilogram beast exploding from the ocean, water cascading like shattered glass as it clamped onto its prey mid-air. The seal didn't have time to react. One snap. Gone. The room fell silent. Even Commander Jutha Zin, their war instructor, narrowed their multiple eyes. The edges of their biosuit tightened reflexively. Varesh's crystalline form dimmed slightly. Efficient, he admitted, but still a brute force predator. Dane chuckled under his breath, shaking his head. Number, you're looking at it wrong. His fingers moved over the display controls and the projection zoomed into the shark's anatomy. The ampullae of Lorenzini, minute electroreceptors clustered across the shark's snout, flared on the readout. It can detect a heartbeat in the water from over 50 meters away, Dane said. It doesn't just see its prey, it feels it, hides beneath the waves, reading pulses, waiting for a single moment of weakness. It knows you're there before you know it's coming. He turned slightly, gaze piercing through Varesh's refracted hues. You call that brute force? That's what real hunting looks like. The murmurs returned, less dismissive now. The Zephyrans shrank back slightly, their water-rich physiology making them easy prey in theory. The Varek chittered among themselves, adjusting the lenses of their vision assist nodes. Jutha Zin's voice cut through the tension like a blade. An impressive creature, Cadet Kestrel. But predators exist on every world. What makes yours exceptional? Dane smiled, but it wasn't friendly. It was the kind of smile his ancestors might have worn standing on a battlefield, watching an enemy realize they had already lost. Because we studied them. His voice dropped, forcing the others to lean in. We mapped every advantage, every flaw. We tested them, tracked them, learned their patterns, and when we were done, he flicked his fingers again. The image changed. This time, a human in full-body diving gear, reaching out to touch the snout of a massive great white. No weapon, no cage, no fear. We dominated them. The weight of his words settled like an incoming storm. A metallic hiss filled the air as one of the Gurzakul shifted uncomfortably, its armored limbs clicking against the floor. Even Varesh had gone entirely still, his crystalline form locked in an unreadable array of light. Jutha Zin exhaled, stepping forward. "An admirable display, Cadet. But tell me, does human warfare work the same way?" The question hung there, electric. Dane tapped the display controls once more. The shark vanished, replaced by something else, a battlefield. Not Earth's. Not yet. Smoke clotted the sky, blotting out distant stars. Torrents of flame devoured ruined cityscapes, their skeletal remains stretching like the ribcage of some long-dead god. Soldiers moved through the wreckage, silent as wraiths, their visors reflecting the burning world around them. And then the sound came, the whine of incoming artillery, the tremor of impact as structures collapsed in on themselves, choking the streets in dust and death. The alien student stiffened, a ripple of unease moving through the room. Varesh's voice was quieter this time. "This isn't simulated, is it?" Dane's jaw tightened. He didn't answer. He didn't have to. Because there, in the corner of the screen, a timestamp flickered in real time. Jutha Zin's expression darkened, their uppermost eye twitching in a rare tell of unease. "This is... current?" Dane finally leaned back, arms draping over the chair. "You wanted to know what makes humans different?" He exhaled, gaze sweeping across the room. "We don't just study war, we perfect it." A sudden harsh beep ripped through the air. The heads-up displays embedded in the Academy's walls flashed red, a new data stream overriding the lecture's feed. Words scrolled across the screen. "Incoming transmission, classified channel." The Academy shuddered. Somewhere deep within the structure, defense systems activated, barriers sliding into place. Dane didn't move. He already knew. The war wasn't theoretical anymore. It had just arrived. The Academy walls shuddered, a deep guttural tremor rolling through the structure, like the growl of a beast awakening from dormancy. The laser plasma displays pulsed, shifting from classroom interface to an emergency feed. The words "incoming transmission," classified channel glared across the screens in stark crimson. Dane didn't move. He already knew. Around him, the war cadets were frozen, their alien features twisted in varying degrees of unease. Varesh's crystalline body had dimmed further, the refraction of his form losing its arrogant luster. The Gurzakul's plated exoskeleton clenched, the seams of its armored joints hissing as it braced instinctively. Even the Zifferans, normally composed in their fluidity, had become rigid, coiling into themselves as though the walls might collapse inward. Commander Jutha Zin exhaled slowly, their uppermost eye flicking to the side. With a flick of their wrist, the transmission opened. The display shifted, flooding the room with static-laced images. A battle. Not simulated. Not past. Now Dane had seen it before. Different planet. Same war. The feed stuttered, momentarily disrupted by electromagnetic interference before stabilizing. A burning colony, its structures silhouetted against a sky thick with falling debris. Troop formations moved through the wreckage, the distinctive gait of Voxir foot soldiers unmistakable, their towering frames loping forward, energy weapons slung low, scanning the ruins for survivors. And then, movement from the shadows, a counterattack, not from a planetary defense force, not from aliens, from humans. Dane could almost smell the battlefield, the metallic tang of scorched metal, the dense musk of earth churned under bootfalls, the unmistakable copper bite of blood in the air. A volley of explosives detonated, swallowing the advancing Voxir in a wave of fire and concussive force. The attackers moved with surgical brutality, cutting through the enemy lines like a blade through exposed flesh. The alien cadets watching did not breathe. The transmission blurred, and then the audio kicked in, a voice deep, composed, utterly human. "Enemy routed. Forward units. Sweep for hostiles. Any civilians left, extract them now. We're cleaning house." Jutha Zin's mandibles twitched. "Pause the feed." The transmission halted, frozen on a frame of a soldier stepping over the smoking corpse of a Voxir, rifle still leveled. The silence in the classroom was thick enough to smother. Varesh's voice was uncharacteristically subdued. "This is not an archive." Dain's expression didn't shift. No. Juthazin turned to him, their secondary limbs flexing slightly, a gesture of guarded calculation. Explain. Dain held their gaze for a beat before pushing back from his seat and standing, rolling his shoulders as though loosening a weight no one else could see. You wanted to understand us. His voice was quiet, measured. So let's talk about war. A murmur rippled through the class, some shifting further away from him, others drawn closer as if proximity might pull them into his understanding. You think apex predators are defined by biology? Dain continued, his gaze sweeping the room. Strength, natural weapons, genetic superiority. You believe warfare is about dominance through physical means. He lifted his chin slightly, jaw tightening. That's not how we survived. The display flickered again, new footage overlaying the battlefield. Not just soldiers this time, something else. A different kind of predator. Urban ruins, shadows where there should be nothing. And then, movement. A Voxir patrol, unaware. A single figure trailing them, unseen. The aliens watching stiffened, alarm rippling through them as the human predator closed in. Slow, methodical. The soldiers didn't notice. They never noticed. Until it was too late. The first Voxir crumpled, a knife driven cleanly into the gap of its armor, one precise, lethal strike before the attacker melted back into the ruins. Around him, the war cadets were frozen, their alien features twisted in varying degrees of unease. Varesh's crystalline body had dimmed further, the refraction of his form losing its arrogant luster. The Gurzakul's plated exoskeleton clenched, the seams of its armored joints hissing as it braced instinctively. Even the Zifferans, normally composed in their fluidity, had become rigid, coiling into themselves as though the walls might collapse inward. Commander Juthazin exhaled slowly, their uppermost eye flicking to the side. With a flick of their wrist, the transmission opened. The display shifted, flooding the room with static-laced images. A battle. Not simulated. Not past. Now Dain had seen it before. Different planet. Same war. The feed stuttered, momentarily disrupted by electromagnetic interference before stabilizing. A burning colony, its structures silhouetted against a sky thick with falling debris. Troop formations moved through the wreckage, the distinctive gait of Voxir foot soldiers unmistakable, their towering frames loping forward, energy weapons slung low, scanning the ruins for survivors. And then, movement from the shadows, a counterattack, not from a planetary defense force, not from aliens, from humans. Dain could almost smell the battlefield, the metallic tang of scorched metal, the dense musk of earth churned under bootfalls, the unmistakable copper bite of blood in the air. A volley of explosives detonated, swallowing the advancing Voxir in a wave of fire and concussive force. The attackers moved with surgical brutality, cutting through the enemy lines like a blade through exposed flesh. The alien cadets watching did not breathe. The transmission blurred, and then the audio kicked in, a voice deep, composed, utterly human. Enemy routed. Forward units. Sweep for hostiles. Any civilians left, extract them now. We're cleaning house. Juthazin's mandibles twitched. Pause the feed. The transmission halted, frozen on a frame of a soldier stepping over the smoking corpse of a Voxir, rifle still leveled. The silence in the classroom was thick enough to smother. Varesh's voice was uncharacteristically subdued. This is not an archive. Dain's expression didn't shift. No. Juthazin turned to him, their secondary limbs flexing slightly, a gesture of guarded calculation. Explain. Dain held their gaze for a beat before pushing back from his seat and standing, rolling his shoulders as though loosening a weight no one else could see. You wanted to understand us. His voice was quiet, measured. So let's talk about war. A murmur rippled through the class, some shifting further away from him, others drawn closer as if proximity might pull them into his understanding. You think apex predators are defined by biology? Dain continued, his gaze sweeping the room. Strength, natural weapons, genetic superiority. You believe warfare is about dominance through physical means. He lifted his chin slightly, jaw tightening. That's not how we survived. The display flickered again, new footage overlaying the battlefield. Not just soldiers this time, something else. A different kind of predator. Urban ruins. Shadows where there should be nothing. And then, movement. A Voxir patrol, unaware. A single figure trailing them, unseen. The aliens watching stiffened, alarm rippling through them as the human predator closed in. Slow, methodical. The soldiers didn't notice. They never noticed. Until it was too late. The first Voxir crumpled, a knife driven cleanly into the gap of its armor, one precise, lethal strike before the attacker melted back into the ruins. The remaining troops panicked, shifting into defensive stances, scanning the darkness, weapons raised, but there was nothing to see. Then another fell, and another. The last one barely had time to scream before it, too, was gone. The display faded, leaving behind only the echo of unseen violence. No one spoke. Jutha Zin's gaze remained locked on Dane, unreadable. Finally they exhaled. This was never meant to be a lesson, was it? Dane tilted his head slightly. Not for you. Jutha Zin's expression hardened. Who else is watching? Dane didn't answer. The commander's secondary limbs curled inward in frustration before they turned back to the display. The battlefield feed had shifted, static warping its edges before stabilizing again. Another transmission, different location, more ruins, more soldiers, more humans, and then something new. The Voxir weren't retreating, they were repositioning. Jutha Zin's eyes narrowed. Expand the feed. The transmission obeyed, the viewport widened, and the room collectively inhaled. Voxir warships, not a raiding party, not an occupation force, a fleet. Jutha Zin's claws clicked against the console. Where was this recorded? The automated feed hesitated, then responded. Location classified. Level 6 authorization required. Dane exhaled through his nose, dragging a hand through his hair. Not good. Jutha Zin turned to him, suspicion coiling in their stance like a tightened spring. Kestrel, are we at war? Dane glanced at the display, watching the distant fire of anti-orbital defenses carving through the void, the slow descent of burning wreckage. The answer was obvious. It had been obvious for a long time. No, he murmured. You are. The laser plasma displays flickered again, this time shifting from the battlefield feed to a new interface. Text scrolling, a notification flaring into existence, a direct message. A name appeared, a single identifier, one that did not belong to any of the students. Jutha Zin stiffened. Who is accessing this line? Dane's stomach coiled. He knew before the message even played. The Academy's defense barriers activated, the room sealing itself under emergency protocols. The walls darkened, the static charge in the air thickening. Then, a voice. This is Admiral Rizek of the United Earth Defense Command. The silence in the room turned to stone. The voice continued, measured, unshaken. Stand by. The war is here. A heavy silence draped over the war room, thick as the storm of data cascading across the laser plasma displays. Red markers flickered in ominous clusters, each one a hostile warship breaching unclaimed space and closing in. The air carried an undercurrent of something metallic like heated alloy and static discharge from the Academy's activated defense systems. Dane Kestrel stood motionless, fingers curled into his palm as he listened to the voice echo through the sealed chamber. This is Admiral Rizek of the United Earth Defense Command. Stand by. The war is here. The words coiled through the room, taut and unyielding. Jutha Zin's secondary limbs flexed, their gaze cutting to Dane. Explain, the commander demanded, voice low, measured. But beneath it lurked something Dane had never heard from them before. Hesitation. Dane exhaled through his nose. What do you want me to say? His voice lacked its usual sharp edge. That this was some grand misunderstanding? That the war's still coming? He gestured toward the displays, where live battlefield transmissions streamed in fractured bursts. Plumes of fire ruptured through distant planetary crusts. Outposts once standing as monuments of diplomacy now crumbled under the weight of orbital bombardments. The planet in focus wasn't Earth, but it didn't have to be. Jutha Zin's throat vibrated in a low, thoughtful hum. Your people knew this was happening. You knew. Dane's jaw tightened. We always knew. A shifting movement caught his attention. Varesh, still unnervingly still, his crystalline form darkened into fractured, unreadable patterns. That transmission, Varesh murmured, more to himself than the room. It was directed to the academy, not military command. Why? Dane's stomach coiled. He could almost hear the unspoken accusation behind the words. This wasn't a warning. It was an invitation. The sharp chime of an incoming transmission sliced through the tension. Incoming, UEDC transmission, classified level 7. Authorization required. The Academy's security system stalled, attempting to override the lockout. Access denied. A second later, the message bypassed the firewall entirely, embedding itself directly into the display. A new voice filled the chamber. Cadet Kestrel. If you're hearing this, then we've run out of alternatives. Dane's breath caught. He recognized that voice. Not Rizek. Heron. The image sharpened, an older woman human, her dark hair streaked with the burden of experience. Deep scars carved into the side of her face, remnants of a battlefield no longer remembered by history, but never forgotten by those who survived it. Admiral Reka Voss. We've lost strategic ground at the Zevran front. The Voxir have deployed their Titan-class dreadnoughts. The casualties are... She hesitated. Rare. She never hesitated. Unacceptable. Dane's pulse ticked faster. You know what this means, Kestrel. He did. The transmission wasn't just a status update. It was a trigger. The Academy's display shifted, maps unfurling into layered war plans, schematics, fleet formations, contingency protocols, but not from the UEDC, not even from the current war, from before. Jutha Zin recoiled slightly. What is this? Dain stared at the screen, unwilling to speak the answer aloud. Varesh was the one to realize it first. This isn't a battle plan. He turned, eyes gleaming with something unreadable. It's an extermination model. The room contracted, shrinking under the weight of those words. Jutha Zin's voice came quieter now, a blade drawn in caution. Who is the target? Dane forced himself to look at them. The Voxir. A ripple of unease slithered through the gathered cadets. Jutha Zin's expression darkened. This was never a war to you. Dane clenched his fists. You don't get it. This was never about territory, never about power. His voice sharpened, a bitter edge creeping in. The Voxir don't take prisoners. They don't negotiate. They don't leave survivors. His gaze flickered to the screen, where warships continued to flood the system, their silhouettes swallowing distant starlight. If they win, we don't get another cycle to recover. We don't get to rebuild. We get erased. Silence. Then a single low, chilling click. Varesh. And so you will erase them first. The air thinned. Dane didn't confirm it. He didn't have to. The transmission crackled again, Admiral Voss's face hardening. Cadet, listen carefully. You're in the center of the most tactically advantageous location in this quadrant. You have access to their war archives, defense analytics, everything. I need you to execute Protocol Eben. The aliens had no context for that phrase, but Jutha Zin did. The commander stiffened, a slow exhale escaping from behind gritted mandibles. You're deploying the Shadow Doctrine. Dain said nothing. Jutha Zin turned away sharply, pacing toward the display, secondary limbs curling inward, posture stiff. The reaction of someone standing at the precipice of understanding and dreading the fall. This is a war crime, they finally muttered. Dane's lips parted in something that might have been a smile if it weren't so devoid of humor. Only if someone lives to report it. The lights flickered, deepening the shadows in the war room. The emergency alert system re-engaged, its electronic pulse syncing with the rhythmic cadence of the approaching fleet. A countdown. The war had already begun. Jutha Zin exhaled sharply. You need to leave, now. Varesh stepped forward. You're protecting him? Jutha Zin didn't look at him, didn't look at any of them, only Dane. I'm protecting what little balance we have left. The airlock alarms triggered, security overrides engaging as the Academy's perimeter shields activated. Outside the reinforced viewport, the first of the Voxir warships descended through the upper atmosphere, their glowing hulls slicing through the night like celestial harbingers of ruin. The transmission flared one final time, Admiral Voss's voice cutting through the chaos like steel through bone. "Kestrel, do not hesitate." Dane met Jutha Zin's gaze. Then he turned and ran. Dane ran. The corridors of the Academy blurred around him, light panels flickering erratically as the facility's defense systems engaged. The distant tremor of planetary shields absorbing impact sent vibrations through the walls, a distant, bone-deep percussion signaling the reality of war. He wasn't running from it, he was running toward it. Ahead, security bulkheads slammed shut, sealing off the main access routes. The Academy's emergency lockdown had begun, designed to isolate and protect non-combatants. He wasn't counted among them. "Override access. Kestrel Delta 9, he barked, skidding to a halt before an access panel. The heads-up display embedded in the wall blinked in hesitation before the Academy's A. I rejected the command. Access denied. Non-command rank. Dane cursed under his breath. There wasn't time for this. Behind him, he could hear the distant, telltale march of security drones deploying into defensive formations, automatic protocols engaging. If he was caught here, the war wouldn't be his only problem. A flicker of movement. Dane whipped around, muscles coiled, ready to strike. But instead of security, he found himself face-to-face with Varesh. The Altari stood just outside the emergency lighting's reach, his crystalline form catching slivers of red illumination, making him appear fractured, shadowed, unreadable. He had followed him. "You're running straight into the fire," Varesh said, voice measured. Dane exhaled sharply. "What do you want?" Varesh tilted his head slightly, light scattering over his shifting exoskeleton. "To understand why you're so eager to burn." Dane's jaw tensed. No time for this. "Move," he ordered, stepping past him. Varesh didn't. "The war has reached your doorstep. Your species is outnumbered, outgunned, strategically disadvantaged. And yet—" He studied Dane, the glow of his refracted hues narrowing. "You're not running from the enemy. You're running to them. That means you have something worse than their weapons." Dane met his gaze, something cold settling behind his own. "We have their fear." The words hung between them, heavy, a realization Varesh hadn't yet spoken aloud. A static burst erupted through the corridor's laser plasma display, snapping both of them toward the alert. Admiral Voss's voice cut through the interference. "Kestrel, update. I don't have time for delays." Dane's fingers flew over the display, rerouting his access directly into the command stream. The security firewall buckled under the override, momentarily fighting before relenting. "Still inside the Academy," Dane reported. "Lockdown protocols are restricting direct launch access. I need an exit." Voss's image flickered, the lighting from her transmission casting angular shadows across her face. "Find one," she snapped. "We're not waiting." The transmission cut. Varesh studied him for a long moment. "Your leaders don't give orders. They give ultimatums." Dane didn't look at him as he re-entered the system, fingers tapping against the screen. "That's the difference between us and you, Varesh. You ask for permission." The access panel flashed green. The security bulkhead unlocked with a hiss, revealing the emergency launch bay. Beyond the reinforced viewport, a warship loomed in low orbit, its dark silhouette bleeding into the backdrop of planetary fire. Varesh exhaled a quiet, metallic chime of disbelief. "You were never a student here," he said, watching as Dane stepped forward, shoulders squared, steps measured. Dane stopped at the threshold, the Academy's sterile air thick with the scent of ionized metal and distant smoke. He turned just enough to glance at the Altari. "I was never here to learn," he admitted. Then he stepped into the bay. The launch deck was chaos. Security personnel scrambled to reconfigure evac transports, their once composed protocol shattering under the reality that the Academy itself was now a battlefield. The defense grid pulsed overhead, bright streaks of kinetic blasts tearing across the shielded perimeter as the Voxir assault pushed forward. Dane moved swiftly, cutting through the confusion. He knew where he needed to go. The strikecraft hangar was positioned along the lower deck, reinforced for fleet deployment. Most of the cadets had no reason to access it, until today. He reached the clearance terminal, re-entering his access code. The AI hesitated. It knew what he was doing. It also knew it couldn't stop him. The hatch slid open. Inside, rows of advanced strike vessels gleamed under the emergency lighting, sleek, sharp-winged, designed for close-quarters combat and atmospheric engagement. Dane exhaled, already scanning for a viable launch sequence. Behind him, footsteps approached. Jutha Zin. The commander stopped just outside the threshold, their form silhouetted against the flashing alarms. "You knew this day would come," Dane murmured, still working through the pre-flight sequence. Jutha Zin exhaled through clenched mandibles. "I just didn't think it would be today." Dine glanced back at them. "You going to stop me?" A long pause. Jutha Zin stepped forward, not to block him, but to watch. "You don't want peace," they said, studying him like a battlefield they were only now understanding. Dane's expression didn't shift. "Peace is an intermission." A low rumble shuddered through the station, the defense grid failing on the western perimeter. The assault was breaching. Jutha Zin's throat vibrated in a quiet note of contemplation. "Do what you came here to do, Kestrel." Dane's fingers closed around the flight controls. The launch bay decompressed, the airlocks engaged, the strikecraft's systems flared to life. As he lifted off, breaking through the barrier between atmosphere and open battle, the war had already shifted. He wasn't escaping. He was hunting. Dane cut through the debris field, the cockpit's heads-up display flooding with proximity alerts. Burning wreckage drifted like broken ribs of a carcass, remnants of ships that hadn't been fast enough. Beyond the field, the Voxir fleet loomed, a wall of war forms stretching into the abyss, their hulls absorbing light, predatory and patient. The UEDC strike force hadn't arrived yet. He was alone. A red flicker flared on his scanner. Incoming. He pushed the thrusters forward, banking hard to starboard as pulse rounds sliced through the void where he had been a heartbeat ago. The first pursuer broke from the debris, a sleek Voxir hunter craft, black vein plating pulsing as if it breathed, organic circuitry alive in ways it shouldn't be. The Voxir didn't build ships, they grew them. Dane gritted his teeth. The targeting system latched onto him, the cockpit filling with the harsh screech of an enemy weapons lock. He didn't wait. Dane killed the main thrusters and let inertia drag him into a controlled drift, flipping the strikecraft belly up while his hands recalibrated the firing vector. The moment the Voxir fighter swept overhead, thinking it had the kill, he pulled the trigger, a flash of light. The hunter craft ruptured in half, spilling fragmented plating into the void. The second pursuer veered off, calculating its odds. Dane exhaled, fingers flexing against the controls. A voice cut through his comms, dry, disapproving. "You always did play too close to the fire, Kestrel." His throat tightened. "Admiral Voss." Dane flicked the comms switch. "Glad you made it. I was starting to think I'd have to fight the entire fleet alone." A static pop. "You wouldn't have lasted 5 minutes." The heads-up display flared as the UEDC fleet exited slipspace, battlecruisers shifting into formation, their silhouettes stark against the distant star field. Fighters swarmed from their launch bays, a coordinated storm of war machines cutting toward the enemy lines. The war had begun. Voss's voice crackled through again. "Kestrel, you have 5 minutes to punch through their outer formation before they collapse our left flank. Get it done." He didn't argue. Dane pulled the throttle hard, diving toward the thick of the battle. Fire consumed the void. The battlefield contracted around him, a kill-box of shifting engagements. Pulse cannons screamed through the black ion trails streaking between warships like veins pulsing with liquid fire. Dane's craft wove between the chaos, the heads-up display flashing new warnings faster than he could acknowledge them. He ducked beneath a UEDC frigate's railgun volley, watching the rounds slam into the hull of an incoming Voxir dreadform, its plating buckling before it corrected course. They were adapting. A new marker flared on his scope. Dane's stomach dropped. "Voss," he said, his voice flatter than before. I see it. So did the fleet. A Voxir Titan-class dreadnought was emerging from the black, a beast of a warship, nearly planetary in scale. Its core pulsed with unnatural light, shifting, writhing. Dane had read the reports. This wasn't just a ship. It was something else. Voss's voice came through, clipped. Confirmed target. Dane forced himself to speak. Dreadnought. The readings are fluctuating. This thing isn't stable. A short pause. Then colder than ice. Then break it before it settles. Dane's breath evened out. His hands moved automatically, adjusting the targeting sequence, calibrating a missile trajectory that might, if he was lucky, hit something vital. Then his scanner glitched. For a split second, the dreadnought's core signature spiked, its biological energy rippling like a heartbeat. Dane's fingers froze over the controls. Voss. No response. The comms distorted, the static thickening, a whisper threading through the interference. Not human, not Voxir, something else. His vision tilted, and for a fraction of a second, he wasn't in the cockpit. He was somewhere else. A void without stars, a whisper without a mouth, something looking back at him. Dane gasped, jerking back into reality. The display had stabilized. The dreadnought was still there. Voss's voice slammed through the comms. Kestrel! Status! His pulse thundered in his ears. He forced himself back into the moment. Still here? Voss exhaled, tension bleeding into her tone. Then stop hesitating and finish this. Dane's fingers flexed. The Voxir thought they were the apex predators here. They weren't. They just didn't know it yet. He armed the warheads and fired. The warheads streaked toward the Voxir dreadnought, their trails carving thin scars of white-hot energy through the battlefield's chaotic dark. Dane kept his gaze locked on the heads-up display, watching the targeting reticle pulse, waiting for impact. A fraction of a second before detonation, the dreadnought shifted. Not an evasion, not a shield activation, a reaction. The ship's core flared, tendrils of writhing light unfurling across its surface like veins pulsing beneath stretched skin. The warheads hit, but instead of erupting in a blaze of fire, they were absorbed, consumed. The energy dissipated into the ship's structure, as if feeding it. Dane's stomach coiled. That wasn't how physics worked. Voss! He snapped into the comms. We have a problem. Static crackled. Then Voss's voice, edged with ice. What am I looking at, Kestrel? Dane gritted his teeth, fingers tightening around the flight controls. Something that doesn't die like it's supposed to. The dreadnought's core pulsed again, only this time it wasn't absorbing energy. It was releasing it. A shockwave burst outward, distorting space itself, bending light in unnatural angles. The smaller UEDC vessels caught in the blast didn't just explode. They unraveled, their structures peeling apart molecule by molecule, erased before the fire could even touch them. Dane's instincts screamed. He banked hard, pulling his strike craft away from the expanding field of decay. Tactical! Pull back! Voss barked over the command channel. That thing is not a ship. It's a goddamn organism. Dane barely registered the words. His eyes were locked on the dreadnought, its form shifting like something waking up. This wasn't a warship. It was a predator. And they had just made it aware of them. The Voxir fleet adjusted, their smaller ships peeling back like a pack making room for their alpha. It wasn't fear. It was reverence. They had been waiting for this moment. Dane's mind raced. Voss, we need a full-range bombardment. Now. Negative, Kestrel, she shot back. We're blind on its core mechanics. If that thing can redirect energy attacks, we're just feeding it. Dane cursed under his breath. They had one chance before the dreadnought fully awakened, before it started hunting. A static burst flared across his comms. Not from UEDC channels. Another frequency, a familiar one. Kestrel. Varesh. Dane's irritation flared. Not the time, Varesh. You're wrong about it. That stopped him cold. Dane flicked his comms to a private channel, voice razor sharp. Explain. Varesh's tone remained eerily calm, even as his crystalline warship dodged pulse fire in the background. The Voxir don't build their weapons, Kestrel. You know this. Dane's fingers twitched. Then what the hell am I looking at? A mistake. The words landed heavier than they should have. Varesh continued, each syllable cutting deliberate. That thing isn't a war machine. It's something they unearthed. Something they woke up. Dane's blood ran cold. You're saying they didn't create it? They don't control it, Varesh corrected. They think they do. That's the difference. Dain's thoughts spun in too many directions at once. If Varesh was right, the Voxir weren't just fielding a biological superweapon. They had tethered themselves to something they didn't understand. And if it had been waiting... Dane's stomach dropped. It's not feeding on the attacks. His voice went flat. It's learning from them. Voss's voice slammed through the comms again. Kestrel, talk to me. Dane forced himself back into the moment. We need to change tactics. We're not fighting a dreadnought. We're fighting something older, smarter. His jaw tightened. It's not a weapon. It's an apex predator, and we just taught it how to kill us. The battlefield lurched into chaos. The dreadnought, no, the Leviathan, reacted. Its core pulsed again, and this time the energy burst was deliberate. The blast radius expanded in a slow, rippling wave, tearing through space like a wound unraveling. The UEDC fleet pulled back, forced to abandon their offensive formation. Several smaller ships vanished in the distortion, their existence erased before they could even send a distress call. Dane's breathing sharpened. Voss, we need to isolate its core. If we let it adapt, it won't stop at this system. Voss's response was instant. You have a plan, Kestrel? He didn't. Not a good one. But he had a target. I need 2 assault wings to divert fire at its outer limbs, he ordered, mind whirling through calculations faster than his pulse. Draw its sensory field outward, force it to allocate energy to movement instead of attack. Voss's voice edged with approval. And what are you doing? Dane locked his targeting system. Going for the brainstem, he dove. The Leviathan stirred as if it had already learned to anticipate his movement. Tendrils of dark matter curled from its structure, flickering with remnants of the energy it had stolen. Dane wove through them, dodging their grasp, but the closer he got, the more space itself seemed to distort. He could feel it, not as a presence, not as a consciousness, as awareness. This thing was watching him. Kestrel! Voss's voice snapped through his headset. His focus flicked to the display. A massive shift in energy was building. The Leviathan was about to attack. Not a pulse, not a distortion. Something worse. Voss, tell me we have an override on the orbital railguns. A pause, then, you better make this count. The energy pulse began to surge. Dane forced everything forward, cutting through the Leviathan's outer membrane in a single violent maneuver. The railguns activated, and he fired. The railguns fired. A streak of kinetic energy tore through the void, a single lance of pure devastation cutting toward the Leviathan's core. The impact landed with a force that bent light, sending gravitational ripples across the battlefield. For an instant, the sheer mass of the creature buckled inward, like a wound forming, like something that could finally bleed. Dane didn't wait for the aftermath. He was already diving, thrusters cutting hard as he maneuvered through the Leviathan's unfurling mass, weaving between shifting limbs of dark matter and living steel. His heads-up display blinked with warnings, heat signatures flaring from the creature's interior. It was still alive. Report! Voss snapped through the comms. Dane gritted his teeth, skimming low along the Leviathan's structure. The railgun strike had damaged it, but not enough. Still breathing, he ground out, flicking through his targeting matrix. I need more than that, Kestrel, Voss barked, her voice edged with battle-worn steel. Dane's fingers danced over the control panel, bringing up a full scan of the Leviathan's form. The damage from the railgun strike was visible, fractures running along the core like a spiderweb of ruptured spacetime. It wasn't just wounded, it was recalculating. Varesh's voice slid through the comms, quiet, edged with something unreadable. You wounded a god. Do you think it won't learn? Dain didn't answer. He was too busy scanning, too busy mapping the Leviathan's structure, forcing his mind to work through the geometry of its existence. It wasn't a ship. It wasn't alive in any way he understood. But it had a center, a locus point, a brainstem. "Voss," he said, voice clipped, "we need to execute a surgical strike. The railguns alone won't finish this. We need a full kinetic breach into its neural core." A pause. Then Voss exhaled, the sound of someone making a decision they couldn't unmake. "What's your plan?" Dane tightened his grip on the controls. "We cut it open." The UEDC fleet reorganized, shifting from defensive retreat into calculated formation. Dane had laid it out in sharp, clean directives. Distraction wing, a coordinated assault designed not to kill, but to pull the Leviathan's attention outward. They would target its limbs, force it to react, to divert its energy away from its core. Orbital lances. Instead of concentrated fire, the fleet would spread their kinetic bombardments in a staggered pattern, creating shockwaves that disrupt its internal stability. Core strike team, a single squadron hand-picked, high risk. Their job, enter the Leviathan's damaged section and deliver a payload directly into its neural network. It was insane. It was the only option. "Kestrel, this is a high-risk execution," Voss warned. "If your calculations are off, then it eats us," Dane cut in. "I know." A short silence. Then, "Get it done." The distraction wing hit first. Strike craft poured into the Leviathan's peripheral range, lighting up the battlefield with firestorms of coordinated barrages. The creature reacted. Tendrils of energy lashed outward, chasing targets, pulling itself apart to retaliate. The orbital lances followed. Heavy kinetic rounds ripped into the fractures, sending concussive blasts through its internal structure. Dane was already inside. His strike craft screamed through the Leviathan's exposed wound, navigating the ruptured pathways where the railgun had torn it open. Flesh and steel blurred together, the air thick with something that wasn't matter, wasn't liquid, wasn't something he could name. A single voice filled his mind. Not through comms, not through sound, through something older. "You are not welcome here." Dane's chest locked, his vision distorting as gravity inverted around him. The cockpit seemed to stretch outward, no longer a ship but a fragment of memory, a battlefield, human, ancient, not in space, not even in time. A war that should have been forgotten. Dane gasped, breaking free of the hallucination as his ship barreled into the final approach. There it was, the neural core, a structure of pulsing, churning non-space, wrapped in layers of shifting light and gravity distortions. It was unraveling itself, reforming. If it finished, they would all die. "Kestrel status," Voss barked. Dane's hands flew across the console. The payload was primed. "Locking in coordinates," he reported. The targeting system struggled to stabilize. The Leviathan was rewriting itself faster than the sensors could track. "Manual fire," he muttered. He grabbed the manual controls. A deep inhale, a single breath, and he fired. The payload launched. A ripple of energy tore through the core, the explosion blooming outward in slow-motion distortion. The Leviathan's entire structure seized, its limbs curling inward, its neural pathways flickering. And then it screamed. The sound was not sound. It was a thought, a rupture in existence itself. The fleet watched as the Leviathan convulsed, its body collapsing in on itself, folding into a singularity of burning gravity. And then it was gone. Just gone. The battlefield went still. Dane floated in the wreckage, breath shallow, mind still reeling from what he had touched. Varesh's voice slid into his comms. "Did you feel it?" Dane didn't answer. He already knew the truth. This war had never been about the Voxir. They were just the messengers, and something far older had been listening. Dane drifted in the wreckage, the aftershock of the Leviathan's collapse still shuddering through his body. The cockpit's heads-up display flickered with residual distortions, struggling to make sense of what had just happened. The battlefield should have been silent, empty in the wake of destruction, but he could still hear it. The Leviathan's final scream wasn't gone. It had left an imprint, a wound in reality that hadn't yet sealed. Something had watched, something had learned. A voice crackled through his comms, sharp, urgent. "Kestrel, respond!" "Admiral Voss." Dane inhaled, forced himself to blink away the haze creeping at the edges of his vision. The war wasn't over. Not yet. "Alive," he managed. His throat felt raw, as if he'd spoken to something that had no language. A brief pause, then Voss exhaled, clipped, but relieved. "Good. Because this isn't finished." Dane glanced at the display, scanning what remained of the battlefield. The Voxir fleet had fractured. Some ships still fought, others were already burning, but many were running. For the first time, they weren't advancing. They were retreating. Dane flexed his fingers around the controls. Predators didn't run unless they saw something greater than themselves. Varesh's voice slid through the comms, low, reflective. "They feared it," he murmured. "And now they fear you." Dane didn't respond immediately. He was still watching the Leviathan's absence, the void it had left behind, an emptiness that felt unnatural. Not gone, just waiting. "They should," he said finally. "They're starting to understand what they're dealing with." Varesh's crystalline form flickered into focus on the laser plasma display, his fractured hues unreadable. "Are they?" Dane exhaled, muscles aching from how tightly he'd held himself together. "No." Varesh inclined his head slightly. "Then teach them." The comms flared again. Voss's voice was steel-sharp. "The Voxir flagship is still operational. It's moving toward the outer colonies. We can't let it regroup." Dane's mind was already shifting into tactical clarity. "We won't." Voss didn't ask for a plan, she just waited, because she already knew he had one. Dane adjusted the flight path, eyes narrowing. "We don't need to chase them. We need to show them there's nowhere left to run." Varesh made a quiet, thoughtful sound, something between understanding and amusement. "You're not just hunting, Kestrel. You're making a lesson out of it." Dane's grip on the controls tightened. That's what apex predators do. He activated the fleet-wide comms, his voice steady, carrying the weight of what it meant to be human. "Form up. This isn't a pursuit. This is a demonstration." The UEDC fleet moved, aligning into formation like a pack of wolves closing in. The Voxir had spent centuries believing they were the deadliest force in the galaxy, that no one could challenge them, that they were the nightmare others feared. They had been wrong. The lesson had just begun. The first strikes landed, and the war shifted from survival to extinction. Dane watched as the Voxir began to falter, as the realization crawled into their bones. He had seen that fear before, in every creature that realized too late that it had underestimated its prey. He leaned back in his seat, feeling the weight of it, the cold inevitability settling around him. "You wanted to know what makes us different," he murmured to no one in particular. The laser plasma displays flickered. The UEDC fleet moved in unison. "Now you know,"